No,
you can be. I could be a Muslim, or I could be a Hindu, and I'd see a poor person, right? And I'd feel compassion. That is a universal gift in human beings. Compassion.
Well, not psychopaths, right?
No, psychopaths.
So there's sadists and psychopaths and
Absolutely.
sociopaths.
Absolutely.
So there's a bunch of people who think that it's good to rape people. So how do you know who's right and how do you know who's wrong? Maybe the psychopath is the right one. Is there like, how do you justify your beliefs about what's right or what's wrong according to your worldview? Do you believe in evolution, that we evolved out of stardust?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, so if we evolved out of stardust, we're basically highly evolved animals. How do you say that violating somebody's body would be immoral and that it should not happen if that person is just another organism in a vast universe?
Well, for some reason, human
organisms
beings have a moral compass, no matter which religion they belong to. It's we live in a society. People are social beings, and they know how to get on in a society, to do things that are good for a society, how to evolve in a society. Of course, from the 100% of people in a society, you've got a certain percentage of people who don't adhere to these rules, or who are mentally ill, like psychopaths, rapists, and so on, whatever. Right?
Well, how do you know that
you have these people?
How do you know who's mentally ill?
In general, people know how to deal in a society.
So you're saying that people can justify their moral system by saying it's good for society?
I think people have been around, or the human species has been around for a long, long time, and they've evolved, and their way of evolving in a society is kind of deeply rooted into people, no matter which religion, no matter which color, no matter which sexuality, right?
So if people think a certain thing ought to happen, does that mean it ought to happen? Or is there a way to distinguish who's right and who's wrong objectively? Or is it just a bunch of preferences and everybody just has their own preferences?
I don't think so. I think in society, most people try to live their life in a society that's beneficial also for the neighbors, for themselves.
Okay, so if it was
being isn't
they would.
It's a conscious organism, right?
Right.
Living in an environment, and so people tend to try to get on as well they can in society.
But at times that involves degrading and abusing human beings in order to thrive for their own personal wealth.
Not the majority. I think the majority of people are pretty much straightforward, right? But as
the majority of people,
you get. I mean, that's the beauty of mankind. We're not robots. Everybody is a bit different.
But
right?
in the 1800s, the majority of people were degrading black people,
Slavery,
and that was advantageous for their vision for society, right? So were they justified in doing that? Were they justified in? Okay, why? Why is it wrong to degrade black people in your worldview? Why do humans have more value than animals in your worldview? How do you justify the belief that humans should get special treatment? Because we hunt deer, right? We squish insects. We treat them differently. But human beings, we have a special way that we treat human beings. So why is that?
Because we're conscious people, right? I've got a consciousness. I can put myself into the shoes of different people.
But at times that doesn't happen. So how do you know who's right and who's wrong when that doesn't happen? When people practice chattel slavery, how can you say that they're wrong if they're just using other animals? Because ultimately everybody's just an animal. So they're using other animals for their own ends. How can you say they shouldn't do that if they're just doing what animals do?
I think there's a level of consciousness between animals and human beings. I mean, you could say that, like, if you talk to a dog owner, for instance, right? He'll tell you right away his dog is kind of not a person yet, but really a living thing. Or you talk to a horse owner, for instance, right? But there's a distinction between an animal and the fully conscious being of a human being.
So why would consciousness make a difference, though? Like, why would consciousness give somebody value?
Because we can put ourselves into shoes of other people. And that's, I guess, also the reason why they slowly but surely got rid of slavery. Because there were more and more people seeing how terrible it was to extradite these people from Africa, bring them over the Atlantic to the Americas.
So you're talking about what people prefer, but you're not talking about what people ought to do, what should happen. So there's a difference between what people prefer and what should happen. So is it just that the only thing that exists is preferences? Some people prefer to degrade black people, other people prefer to not do that, and over time preferences change so that black people were treated better? Or is it objectively true? Is it a law existing in the universe that you should not treat black people as lesser than white people?
I think what biology shows us, right, is that there's hardly any distinction between white, black, or colored people. From the DNA and from the way the people, the setup, the body from hair down to the toenails is 99.9% identical. There's not much difference there, except the pigmentation of the skin. That's the only difference.
So if somebody's in front of you...
and for this 0.001 difference because of the pigmentation of the skin, to treat a person differently than you would treat a white person doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? It's a
why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Because every human being is just an organism that evolved out of stardust. We're just matter in motion with maybe an immaterial consciousness. But why would it matter in an atheistic evolutionary worldview? Why would it matter what happens to any human? How would you convince somebody who's abusing a black person? How would you ever convince them and say, hey, you should not do that? Because in your worldview, all you can say is, oh, that's your preference to do that. It's my preference that you not do that. Don't do that because I don't like you doing that. But there's no way for you to appeal to an objective standard by which you can say, hey man,
Absolutely.
There's actually a law from God that says you should not treat that black person that way, therefore you should not treat that black person that way. But you have no weight behind your argument.
Absolutely. You don't need God for this argument. You don't even need religion.
Well, how do you persuade somebody that they shouldn't degrade a black person?
You need biology, right?
How would that...
Because you know what skin pigmentation is? It's the skin cells that are different between black and white people. That's all it is.
Yeah, but how is that going to convince somebody who likes abusing black people?
The problem is it's a social... cheers, man. Thank you very
thanks.
Much. What you have here is lack of education, right? A lot of stuff that mankind, the human species, has discovered in the last 200-300 years is really remarkable.
But why would biology and the way their bodies are, why would that be a reason to not abuse them? Like, there's no weight behind that argument. You can't. It's like, oh, this human has these certain characteristics, therefore you shouldn't abuse them. It just doesn't follow logically.
It does, because basically the same, right?
But similarity doesn't mean you shouldn't treat somebody that way.
No.
Like, just because you're similar doesn't mean you shouldn't abuse somebody.
No, you wouldn't enslave a white person.
What?
Would you say white people can be slaves too? I mean, I'm sure. White people were slaves somewhere along
Sure, white
history.
people have been enslaved too. And so how do you...
as well.
So how do you ever have any weight behind your argument to say you shouldn't...
I'm coming back again to my argument before that most people have a moral compass in their head because they grew up in a society and they know kind of what is right or what is wrong.
Well, it's just a preference.
I don't think so. I think people generally know how that you can't or you should not kill.
But how can there be
unless you have a compelling reason, unless you've got reasons like tribalism, for instance. Two tribes fight against each other, resources, not enough resources, etc., etc. Well, why tribes go to war.
When you ever have an ought, like you ought to do this or you ought not do that, the only way that can exist is in the context of a lawgiver giving a law, or somebody saying this should be this way. And so
I think you're right.
And so a bunch of humans have said, based off of their own preferences, we should not degrade other human beings. But then another group of humans has said, we should degrade certain human beings. And so how do you know which humans are right and which humans are wrong? How do you determine which is right and which is wrong and which should be followed?
Because what happens then is people start a dialogue. And that's what happened in the 18th century in England, when people started to realize that there was not different, that was pretty horrific what they were doing for economical reasons to build up a whole industry in the Americas. People realized that it was wrong and started bringing forth arguments why it was wrong, and more people started listening, and their own consciousness started telling them that's not okay if I treat my fellow person as property. And
so what standard would they be appealing to say this should not happen if it's just there has to be an outside standard that they're appealing to say this is wrong, instead of just saying I don't want this to happen? They have to appeal to something besides their preferences. In an atheistic evolutionary worldview, all you have is just the preferences to fall back on. If you say, well, I've come to the conclusion that I should no longer treat this black person like an animal. Okay, you've come to that conclusion. Now that's your preference. But what law is that appealing to besides personal preference? What law says you ought not treat a black person this way?
What you're talking about here is sociology. What you're talking about is law, actually, right? So people come together, they understand that what they were doing was not okay. So they openly discuss it, and then they ban ideas that were not okay. So I don't know, 1830, I don't know when slavery was banned in the UK, and then slavery was banned in the Americas as well, because the majority of people thought it was a bad idea and brought it to law. They made a law out of it. So people evolve slowly through time.
But when they say
get smarter.
But when they say this is not okay, they're emoting about a belief. They're saying, I don't prefer this. I've decided that this shouldn't happen.
Right. They believe in something, and
but
they say it should be changed.
Right. Yeah. But other people believe the opposite, and they say, I believe this should happen. So again, how do you determine which of them is right and which of them is wrong?
That's a very philosophical discussion. It's
right. That's the discussion.
And antithesis.
And
that's when people come together and exchange their viewpoints until they bring in a common denominator of an idea. Thesis, antithesis.
It's a bunch of human opinions. At the end of the day, in your worldview, it's all a bunch of human opinions.
They discuss ideas.
And humans become like little lawgivers who say this should not happen. But at the same time, there's a bunch of other people who are also humans who say, well, I think this should happen. So, and there's contradicting laws created by different humans who say this should happen, this shouldn't happen, and all that is based off of is my preferences, instead of an objective law given by a creator who's going to judge all humans by the one standard of his law, who created the nature of reality, whose character is the basis by which something can be declared right or wrong.
Excuse me, sir. Can you give me something to drink?
I don't have any cash, sorry.
A cigarette?
No, I don't smoke.
It seems to me it makes more sense to appeal to a law from one being whose law is given to all the different other beings who's above them, as opposed to just believing that there's a bunch of different contradicting laws from all these beings who are on the same playing field.
That's okay. That's your point of view, right? That's your point of view.
Well, right. I'm saying that it's a way. That justifies.
That makes more sense to you, that there is a deity giving some order, and that's why mankind is going in the direction that it's going. That's okay. That's your opinion.
Well, I just don't know how else you would say that something is objectively wrong if there's not a law that is given to all people at all times to say this is right or that's wrong. Because when you say that's wrong, that shouldn't happen, you become a lawgiver and you say this shouldn't happen, this is my law I'm giving to you that applies to you right now, but that law does not apply to all. That law is not being given to all other people.
That's why mankind invented the judicial system, right? That's why they appointed. What they try to do is they try to bring society into ethical and into laws. That's what has been going on. So England has not a written constitution. I'm Austrian. Austria has a written constitution. So it tells you exactly how society should behave. And it was very sane people writing down the way society should abide to law and order.
So that means your belief leads to might makes right. So whatever the majority believes, whatever the majority prefers, becomes the standard for morality, and that's a big problem with that. That's how you get genocide. That's how you get mass abuse of black people in colonial America.
That's why you have to rethink these ideas, and there are a lot of things, a lot of ideas today that you have to rethink.
But that's just your preference. Other people think differently than you, and they say we don't need to rethink that. It's good to abuse people. And so how would you ever convince them to not abuse somebody if a person is just a collection of chemical reactions and this consciousness that just came into being over billions of years? Like, you don't have any weight behind your argument to say you shouldn't do anything to that person in your evolutionary worldview.
I think you do, because
there's another organism.
No, we live in a society, right? We are not individuals. One person living on a plane. We're living here in a city. I don't know how many million people